Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 244, Aftermath. In our last episode, Cortés finally conquered Tenochtitlan. For all practical purposes, the empire that was Old Mexico was finished before the final siege even began. It took several months, but Cortés finally beat and starved the Mexica into submission. The downside, of course, was that, in doing so, Cortés had all but destroyed the Venice of the West, the gleaming city of Tenochtitlan he had hoped to turn over to Charles V intact. Now, there was little to turn over but rubble and corpses. And therein lies the problem. All of Cortés's decision-making turned on the goal of getting fast, movable wealth that could easily be sent to Spain to justify Cortés's entire conquest. Now, it seemed that this was an ephemeral vision at best. So, what to do? In this episode, we find Cortés trying to regroup again and create something lasting in New Spain. Cortés had conquered an empire. He had used well his talents for flattery, for courtesy, for eloquence, for swift decision-making, for improvisation, for deviousness, and for sudden changes of plans. His will and courage in adversity had always been decisive. He had used terror coldly and effectively. His ambition to achieve something astonishing should have been satisfied. Cortés had also done all this with men of his own choosing. These men would be fiercely loyal to Cortés in the aftermath, especially given the reality that they depended on Cortés to get some of the largesse they had been promised. They understood that if some new governor swept in now, it probably wouldn't get anything. Yet something essential was missing. Neither Cortés nor anyone else knew what Charles V thought of their conquest. It had been 2 years since Cortés' men had set off for Spain. In August 1521, Cortés wrote a quick note home that he had conquered the Mexica, which wasn't exactly true at the time. But that note only reached Spain in March of 1522, nearly 6 months later. Cortés didn't know this, but Charles's court had vacillated wildly over the New World in the past 2 years. Men like Diego Velázquez, who had been so slighted by Cortés, still wanted to be more reasonable in their approach. They wanted to establish a firm encomienda system that would provide consistent harvests of tobacco and other cash crops. The other faction saw the New World as a sort of unlimited ATM. Their goal was to transfer the wealth of the New World to the Old World. Full stop. They had no real plan after that. Luckily for Cortés and unluckily for Velázquez, this latter group was in ascension in 1522. The Spanish court once again looked across the ocean and saw the New World as an unlimited land of milk and honey, of romance, for conquering. This vision of the New World favored conquistadors like Cortés, men with big ambitions, willing to take huge risks for the potential of huge rewards. Of course, what Cortés did not know was that Europe at present was dealing with another major issue, the Reformation. Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli were in full swing at the moment, And so Charles didn't have much time to devote to pondering the New World. Moreover, this was still the age of Charles versus Francis in northern Italy. The Battle of Pavia was now only 3 years away. So Charles had a lot on his plate, leaving Cortés alone for his first year as sort of de facto Mexican emperor between 1522 and 1523. This year was marked by several phenomena. One, the physical recovery of the Europeans. Remember, many had been wounded. Two, the beginnings of the reconstruction of Tenochtitlan. Number 3, a ruthless search for gold. Number 4, the end of traditional Mexican religious practices. And number 5, the colonization of other parts of Old Mexico outside of Tenochtitlan. Cortés worked quickly in 1522 to establish himself at Coyoacan, the old palace of the emperor. That is where he decided to set up his temporary government of Mexico. So far as the administration of Old Mexico was concerned, Cortés decided he would stick to the established model, or at least he would try. Essentially, Cortés would let the existing non-Mexica nobles govern, and then he would govern through them. But this could only work so well, because the reality is that the old Mexica system was based on military dominance. So for the tribute system to function, Spanish military dominance had to replace Mexican military dominance. Cortés couldn't just leave a void and walk away. But for the moment, Cortés faced other more immediate problems. The most critical of these was the food shortage. As a result of the siege, there essentially was no corn crop in 1523 in the Central Valley. Or, at the very least, the corn crop that year was a fraction of what it had been years prior. Cortés responded to this problem pretty simply and brutally. The Mexica, those who had survived, would suffer the most. Cortés would feed his men, then his Indian allies, and the conquered last. Cortés behaved very much like an absolute monarch in these early years. Frankly, there was no reason for him not to. Absent any information from Europe, Cortés had little choice but to continue doing what he felt was right. He began at least trying to rebuild Tenochtitlan, though, at least initially in 1522, he and his lieutenants firmly believed the site would have to be abandoned sooner rather than later. And here Cortés made some use of the imprisoned Cuauhtémoc. Like he had with Montezuma, Cortés paraded the deposed emperor out when it suited his purposes. He tried to use Cuauhtémoc to get his people to repair the water pipes essential for bringing drinking water into the inner city. At the very least, he hoped that the Mexica would clear the streets of debris and dead body. They did to some extent. Cortés also tried to get people to live in the less destroyed northern suburbs of the city. He built a new harbor at Texcoco to try and reinvigorate trade. Like with the cleanup efforts, these had, at best, a middling effect. And then there was the gold. Cortés was relentless. Where was the gold? In part, this was out of pure greed, but in part it was out of necessity. The king's royal officials, once the dust settled and Tenochtitlan was in Spanish hands, were equally as relentless. They wanted the gold too. Charles got a fifth of whatever the conquistadors found, and you can bet your bottom dollar he was going to get it. Remember, he needed to pay all those creditors who paid his way to the Holy Roman throne. So Cortés summoned his leading prisoners and put them to the question. Where were they hiding the gold? By and large, these men did not know. And if they did know, they struggled to explain their answers to the Europeans. You see, a lot of the luxury goods of old Mexico, the gold, the silver, the feathers, the jade, the amber, all these things were in the warehouses of the long-distance merchants. The Spanish simply failed to understand that trade was quite advanced in old Mexico. Their bias hid the truth from them, to their detriment. This will not be the last time in our story that people allow their biases to cloud their judgment and, in the end, find themselves harmed by their own blinders. None of this helped Cuauhtémoc, who was tortured to reveal the location of his allegedly hidden gold. Cuauhtémoc was tied to a stake, had his feet doused in oil, and then set on fire. The last emperor of Mexico tried to strangle himself on the pole due to the pain. In the end, one of his close advisors, up next for the same treatment, begged Cuauhtémoc to say something, anything, to get him off the hook. Cuauhtémoc only sneered, looked daggers at him, and then said, quote, "Am I enjoying some kind of delight or bath?" End quote. A few days later, Cortés had him hanged. The consequence of all this brutality was unsatisfying for everyone involved. The new sum available was around 185,000 to 200,000 pesos worth of gold and silver. The crown's fifth was set at 37,000 pesos, and Cortés took another 26,000 as his fifth. That left around 120,000 pesos to be divided amongst the remaining 750 men. That, if you do the math, is a paltry 160 pesos per man. Given all that these men had been through over the past several years, I think anyone would say it had not been worth it. Those saddles made of gold, well, I guess not. Of course, there were other spoils. There were slaves and some jewels. But in the end, suffice it to say that those who signed up to go with Cortés back in 1519, 1521, did not get the riches they had been promised. And in case you're wondering, no, Cortés was unwilling to even consider dipping into his fifth to compensate them. Desperate to keep his restive men busy, Cortés decided he would send some of them to form new colonies. The emphasis on new conquests shows the frontier spirit of these conquistadors. Now, also after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, Cortés faced the most serious challenge to his authority since the coming of Narvaez. Back in Veracruz, Cristobal de Tapia stepped off a boat fresh from Hispaniola. He had orders in his possession to take over New Spain, and these orders came directly from the court at Castile. Tapia reached what is today Mexico in December 1521. He sent Cortés a letter, but Cortés knew of his arrival long before receiving it. Tapia met with some of Cortés's lieutenants on December the 24th, 1521. Those who met with Tapia were polite but very determined. They looked at his orders, several of them even kissed them, they were from the court in Castile, after all, and then talked quietly amongst themselves for a moment. Then they came back and gave Tapia a firm no thank you. Tapia's orders appointed him governor. The men told him that they understood that these orders came from Charles V. However, they told their new ostensible governor that he didn't understand anything about the situation in Mexico. He might have legal training, but he was totally unprepared for the challenges posed in this new Spain. No, they said, they would not obey his orders. Instead, they would write an appeal to the king. And in the meantime, Cortés, in their minds at least, remained governor. Tapia seemed ready to accept the situation. But then several men from Narvaez's expedition approached Tapia with their own letters. We do not have these today, but whatever was in them convinced Tapia to make another go of it. He said he would remain in Mexico as a private citizen. But by now, Sandoval, Cortés's faithful servant, was on the scene. And he was, just a bit firmer with this would-be governor. He understood that whether Tapia remained as a private citizen or as a member of the government, him simply remaining in Mexico would be a thorn in Cortés's side that would not go away. So Sandoval went to Tapia and told him point blank, "You have to go." Tapia tried to delay, arguing he needed to sell some slaves. Sandoval told him, "No, I'll sell the slaves for you, but you need to leave now." When Tapia again prevaricated, Sandoval told him, "Look, buddy, you're either getting on a ship or you're going back to Santo Domingo in a canoe. Your choice." Tapia chose the ship, and Sandoval stayed on the shore, watching the whole time until the ship receded into the horizon. Once again, the loyalty Cortés had instilled in his friends saved him. Back in Tenochtitlan, Cortés also decided he hadn't quite fulfilled the wanderlust in his gut. He began a series of local campaigns, the most significant of which were all to the east. This one campaign alone took Cortés most of 1522. Cortés would later complain that this campaign added an important and fertile region to New Spain, that he was never compensated for all his expenses. We need to take that comment with a grain of salt. Cortés would spend much of his final years telling anyone who would listen how he had done more than his fair share for the Spanish crown and had not been compensated. There may or may not have been any truth to it. One thing is really interesting about these campaigns, however. Sure, Cortés took the usual Tlaxcalan and Texcocan warriors and lords with him, but he also took a large number of Mexica lords and warriors. Evidently, with the fight for Tenochtitlan over, Cortés felt he could turn the other cheek. Moreover, by early 1522, Cortés had clearly determined to rebuild Tenochtitlan. That decision was controversial. Frankly, it was controversial partly because for Cortés, it was a complete about-face in policy. Cortés had previously said Tenochtitlan would be abandoned, and anyone caught there would be hanged. Then, by February 1522, Cortés completely changed his mind. That winter rebuilding was already underway. According to our sources, by the spring of 1523, there were 400,000 Mexicans working to rebuild Tenochtitlan. An exaggeration? Of course. How much, though? Well, that's hard to say. Very quickly, Tenochtitlan began to take shape once more. It helped that the Mexica took to European construction methods like fish to water. From nails and pulleys to candles and steel knives, they immediately grasped the advantages of it all. While the Mexica knew about the wheel, they had never conceived of the wheelbarrow. And when mules arrived from Spain, well, that just about changed everything. Like I said in the last episode, Old Mexico was gone. It is almost like turning a page. New Spain was here to stay. Yet, speaking of Old Spain, Cortés still had no message from Castile. He had no orders from Charles V, and frankly, he had no idea what was going on in Europe. We need to remember that during the early modern period, the fastest news could travel was the fastest a horse could ride or a ship could sail. Men like Cortés had to make decisions in the dark. So Cortés sent more letters home, desperate for news. He also sent home a massive treasure, about 50,000 pesos in gold. Most of this was in the form of gifts to various churches and to Bishop Fonseca himself. Remember, during the early years of the United Spanish monarchy, this bishop and other churchmen were the administration of the empire. By favoring them, Cortés hoped to get a little love back himself. Now, sadly, one of Cortés's treasure fleets was attacked by a French pirate by the name of Jean Fleuret between the Azores and Spain. Many of Cortés's gifts were lost. While the incident would spark a conversation back in Spain about the need for treasure convoys, which would actually become the dominant mode of transporting treasure from the New World to the Old World in short order, those discussions came too late to help Cortés. One of his 3 ships did manage to escape the pirates' clutches and reach Spain on November the 8th. Now, things in Spain were very different than they had been in 1519. News of the fall of Tenochtitlan reached Europe on March the 1st, 1522. Pope Adrian, though distracted by his scheduled meeting with Martin Luther, issued a papal bull reminding everyone that missionaries needed to be a major part of the expeditions to Mexico. It would be his final word on the subject. Adrian's papacy was as painful as it was brief. As for Charles, he seems to have been interested in the news from New Spain. On a visit to England that June, Charles showed King Henry VIII some of the initial treasures Cortés sent him from Mexico. The emperor then continued on to Valladolid in Spain, where he would remain the next 7 years, the longest period he would stay in one place. One of Charles's first decisions upon arrival in Spain was to appoint a special committee to advise him on Cortés. Crucially, the conservative Bishop Fonseca was not a member of this council. And the committee was blunt in its findings and its decision. Cortés would be required to repay Velázquez for what he had loaned him for the fleet back in 1518. But beyond that, any disputes the two men had were to be settled in the courts, and Velázquez was told point blank not to interfere with Cortés's affairs any longer. It certainly helped Cortés's case that Mexican gold was already, by winter 1522, funding King Charles's Italian wars. Charles happily received the committee's findings, and on October the 11th, 1522, he formally appointed Cortés as the governor of New Spain. That same order also fixed salaries for Cortés and all the other officials in New Spain. Cortés would get 366,000 maravedis per year. Foot soldiers would get a little less, 11,832, a very exact figure for the time. But much to Cortés's chagrin, other new royal officials would get 500,010 maravedis per year. Cortés, in the end, if you look at the salaries, he got a little more than some other conquistadors who had discovered really small islands in the Caribbean. All in all, I mean, if we're just looking at land here, it certainly seems like he deserved a bigger share. But he didn't get it. It took, as you can guess, forever for this news to reach the New World. One group was sent to Mexico to give Cortés the good news. Another went to Cuba to give Governor Velázquez the bad news. In the meantime, before the news got there, Cortés continued to work on New Spain. His biggest challenge was how to set up some kind of economic system in New Spain that would encourage cooperation between the native Indians and the arriving Europeans. To his credit, Cortés firmly believed that the Mexica were much more sophisticated, much more intelligent than the native Taínos in the Caribbean. And therefore, initially at least, he wanted to avoid a strict encomienda system. But in the end, he caved to the demands of his men. They had risked their lives for him, and for what turned out to be a paltry amount of gold. They wanted to be repaid. And this time they wanted to be repaid with lavish estates and men and women to work them. So in the end, Cortés assigned different Mexican lords to different Europeans, granted the latter the former's lands, and told everyone to get to work. Cortés maybe wanted to do the right thing at first, but in the end, he's still a conquistador. The Spanish quickly developed legal systems with the express intent of ensnaring the Mexicans and using legal apparati to make them work. But the Mexica quickly mastered litigation. They took the Spanish to court all the time, consistently charging them with all sorts of breaches of the law. Their favorite was neglecting their religious responsibilities, which, given the kind of men who came to the New World to make their fortunes, was probably an easy charge to make stick. Despite some of his initial hesitation, Cortés quickly took a keen interest in seeing the system succeed and in himself being a part of that success. He allocated himself, by his own estimate, 1 million souls for his own lands. He also worked to import cows, sheep, and pigs, with the intent of making Mexico agriculturally productive in a European sense. To keep the people pacified, Cortés imported mendicant friars to convert the population of Mexico en masse. Cortés thought that Christianity could keep the people of Mexico docile and under the Spanish thumb. He wasn't necessarily wrong, and under Cortés, 50 years of domination by the religious orders began, mostly the Dominicans and Augustinians. But as we're going to see, it didn't last forever. Cortés also wanted to ensure that he could defend his new province. So he sought to build the first factories for gunpowder and artillery manufacture in the New World. On September 13th, 1523, those emissaries from Spain finally reached Cortés and informed him he was now legally the governor of New Spain. He was jubilant. Cortés had faced obstacles too numerous to count in his quest to conquer Mexico. But through a combination of audacity, courage, ruthlessness, and downright good luck, Cortés outlasted and overcame them all. A great-grandson of Montezuma later reflected on the level of change that swept Mexico between 1519 and when he wrote in 1587. Culturally, the landscape had been transformed. The conquering Europeans had by then covered the land with monasteries, churches, shrines, and parishes. By the late 16th century, Mexico was a Catholic kingdom, and it remains a Catholic country today. The turning point, for those interested, came in 1531, when the Virgin Mary was supposed to have appeared with dark skin, beginning the cult of the Brown Virgin, or, if, like me, you attended Catholic services growing up, you might know her as the Virgin of Guadalupe. She was the first divine hero-heroine for the new kingdom. She would not be the last. The landscape had also been transformed in another, very physical way. Historians estimate the population of Old Mexico in 1519 as to be in the range of 8 million people. In 1560, the same region had a population of only 2.6 million, about a quarter of what it had been. Through disease, mostly, starvation, and war, the population of Old Mexico had been virtually wiped out. One historian I read made a comparison that I think is particularly apt. Had Old Mexico's population not plummeted like it did, then New Spain would have looked a lot more like colonialism in India, where you had two distinct classes of people, the ruling British and the native Indian population. Instead, in New Spain, what we see is a relatively small group of immigrants, mostly men from Spain, intermarrying with native Mexicans to produce a new class of people. We're talking about a very small number of Spaniards here who are willing to make the journey to Mexico. Maybe around 150,000, probably less. This is a phenomenon we will talk about a lot more in future episodes, how the ethnic makeup of different classes ultimately structured how whole nations design their economic and political systems. But that is a story for another day. By 1598, we still have some records of the descendants of Montezuma living in poverty. Marina, Cortés's crucial interpreter, lived on until 1551. She later married a Spaniard and had a daughter. She also had a son, but his father was Hernan Cortés. As for the other main loser in all this in terms of political winners and losers, poor old governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, died in 1524. A footnote in the history and story of the man he did everything to stop. All of Cortés's main companions, by and large, died in Mexico. Narváez, after making his way back to Cuba, took part in Ponce de Leon's voyage to Florida to find the Fountain of Youth. Like just about everyone who took part in that expedition, he died horribly. As for Cortés, well, his life continued on. He was still under 40 in 1525. Many might have wondered what the future would hold for the man who conquered Old Mexico. But in many ways, his life was over. He had already hit his crescendo. Other men, like Francisco Pizarro, would conquer other indigenous empires. But not Cortés. His conquistador days were over. Cortés tried to recapture some of the old glory by marching with a large army to what is today Honduras. Few of his men survived, and the expedition accomplished nothing. Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan to find that the city deteriorated in his absence. Throughout 1526, Cortés tried to reestablish order, but he was just worn out. By March 1528, he was on a ship bound for Spain. Charles V at first welcomed him warmly. Later on, however, he would find his favorite conquistador had a bit too much bravado. As you might remember from our episodes on Charles, Cortés was there in person during the Spanish failed attempt to recapture Tunisia from the Ottoman Turks. Cortés famously wanted Charles to lead his men on what would have been a sure suicide mission straight into the enemy defenses, insisting all the while they could win. I mean, after all, Cortés, had attacked larger numbers and won in Mexico, had he not? But the Ottomans were not the Mexica. And this is just one example of how, in so many ways, Cortés struggled to find a place back in Europe. In the spring of 1530, he decided he would return to Mexico. He arrived in Veracruz on July the 15th, 1530. He embarked on a few more expeditions to the Pacific, searching for the rumored strait linking that ocean with the Caribbean Sea. He never found it, mostly because, it doesn't exist. Past the prime of his life in the 1540s, he decided to call it quits and permanently return to Spain. He spent the last years of his life alone with his family, increasingly consumed by his own legacy and illusions of grandeur. He never felt that Charles or any of the Spanish nobility gave him enough credit for what he had accomplished. He died on December the 2nd, 1547. He left behind massive wealth, a large family, and a legend almost too great to fathom. I think the word that best encapsulates Cortés is audacity. Cortés was a gambler to the very end. Time and time again, he was outnumbered, outgunned, and often outmaneuvered. Yet surrender was a word he didn't understand. He was the epitome of an age that valued courage and risk-taking. And he remains today the ultimate conquistador. Before we turn to the Inca next week, and the aforementioned Francisco Pizarro, I want to leave you with Cortés's own words that I think sum up how he thought about himself. In 1524, Cortés sent a model silver cannon to Charles V. The silver, fittingly, came from Montezuma's own mines. On it, Cortés inscribed the following, directed to Charles. Quote, "This was born without equal. I am without a second in serving you. You are without equal in the world."